Happy Monday and welcome to Reading the Bible is Easy-ish, where each week we try to meaningfully engage a passage of scripture from the Bible. Most weeks I'm joined by a guest, but I'm excited to announce in the coming couple of weeks we are hopefully going to be adding a semi-regular co-host to the show. And so it'll be two voices pretty consistently on the show, but we'll still be inviting guests on to introduce a more diverse perspective to the scripture. But I'm hopeful that adding the co-host will make the process of recruiting guests a little bit easier. And hopefully it'll be meaningful too to have a couple of consistent voices to engage with on this platform. So as always, if you enjoy the show, if you're watching on YouTube or whatever podcast provider you've found the show on, I'd invite you to like and subscribe. And please, if you're enjoying the show, share it with friends who you think might like it. You can do that on Facebook or any other social media, however you choose to do that. So without too much other preambling, we're going to dive right into the scripture. I will say for those on YouTube, nothing makes you feel less symmetrical than wearing a hat on a screen. So my face looks a little asymmetrical, but let's dive right into the text for today. John 10, 11 to 18. And I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. That's my preferred translation. It's the translation that I was taught with in seminary and being taught with in seminary and was an undergrad as well. So again, that's John 10, 11 to 18. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand who is not the shepherd does not own the sheep, sees the wolves coming and leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because a hired hand does not care for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay my life down in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. I have received this command from my Father. So just as we do each week, I'm going to set a 5-minute timer for myself, and that will be the limit of how long we engage the text this week. So with 5 minutes on the clock, I'll begin. So John 10 is actually a text that I think a lot of people are familiar with. This is an image, at least, that a lot of people are familiar with. Jesus or God is a shepherd. It's something that we talk about a lot, and especially something that we talk about a lot for pastors as well. They're shepherds of their flock. They're shepherds of their congregation. And it's a way of talking about taking care or being a guide. But in this metaphor, this extended metaphor that we have here in John 10, there are a couple of different things that I think are interesting. So the shepherd has multiple roles, right? And we see this if you go back a little further, even to the beginning of chapter 10, there are additional roles that the shepherd seems to be playing. But beginning in verse 11, we do have multiple roles. And what stands out is the dedication to me in the relationship that the shepherd seems to have with his sheep, if we're just staying in the metaphor. So some examples, if you go all the way back to verse 3, which we didn't read, the shepherd knows the sheep by name. And then in verse 15, which we did read, he is willing to lay down his life for his sheep. And even in this text, we get, they know me and I know them, and they know my voice and they respond to it. And so I'm not especially familiar with large-scale herding like the readers of John might have been, but it would seem to me that these are exceptionally unusual traits for a shepherd to have, right? That they know their flock this well. I could be wrong. I'm not sure. It becomes a little harder to stick with the metaphor for me once we get to verse 16. We're talking about here this metaphor that's a little vague and a little hard for us to understand maybe, where Jesus says, I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice, so there will be one flock, one shepherd. So what I'm drawn to here, and this is a guess on my part instead of something that I know for sure, but my guess is the readers of this text may have had some idea of what the gospel writer in the Gospel of John was intending by these two separate flocks, right? Now we can make assumptions, and we can draw modern day parallels, and I think we can pull some significant meaning from that text. But John, we think, is the latest gospel written, and it is, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many scholars, the most metaphorical, the one that makes the most meaning. It's not quite the way I want to say that, but has some hidden meaning, perhaps, or layers of meaning that are a little harder to parse than the other gospels. And so I do wonder here what John is doing. Who are these multiple flocks, and what is it going to take to merge these flocks together? And as with a lot of the other gospels, there's an assumption, I think, especially at the end of this in verses 17 and 18, where Jesus says, for this reason, the Father loves me, that I lay my life down in order to take it up again. And then again in 18, that Jesus will lay his life down on his own accord. It has the power to lay it down and the power to take it up again. The Gospels are assuming that we know the ending of the story, right? This is not a story full of suspense. If you're reading the Bible for the first time, having never heard this narrative of the resurrected Christ, right? And you start reading any of the four Gospels, pretty early on, you're going to have some strong hints or maybe some outright statements about how this is going to end. Jesus is going to die and there's going to be resurrection. The only exception to that, right, is Mark, where we, in Mark 16, as we talked about with Dave McNeely back a couple of weeks ago, it just kind of ends abruptly. And so there's an assumption, I think, by the writer here that we're going to know the end of the story, that Jesus has laid his life down and has taken it up again. And so there's an effort here, I think, at the end of this passage to do some Christological work, to do some work on who gives Jesus the power to do these things? Why is it important that Jesus lays his own life down and it's not taken from him? Right? Those are questions that I'm holding. And they inform, I think, how we think about Jesus, and probably in turn how we think about our faith. Now, there's some just helpful metaphors here that I think are worthwhile for daily living, right? There's the relationship between the shepherd as compared to the person who's the hired hand. Right, the hired hand isn't committed. They're paid to be there, and they're there for the pay. They're not there for the sheep. And so there's a sense of relationship with the good shepherd. And if we're assuming that Jesus is the good shepherd, there's a sense of assurance in being in relationship with Jesus, that Jesus is going to be constant and present. And one thing that I'm just thinking about now is that that's the end of our 5 minutes. I'll finish that thought. There is the thought, right, that the wolf will come, and the good shepherd just promises to be there. I do wonder if that's taking that metaphor a bit too far, though. So as is our practice each week, I will offer a couple of things that I think are worthwhile to think about, to ponder on for the next week as we kind of move into worship, where at 7th Street Christian Church, where I am located, we will engage this text in worship. So John, as I've said, is a highly, to me, metaphorical book. There's layers of meaning here that would be really helpful to contextualize with chapters 9 and 11, so that the chapter that comes right before this and right after this. And I do think if you're reading this and trying to get a little deeper into the meaning, it's important to go all the way back to the beginning of chapter 10, where this shepherd metaphor really begins. So I think that's helpful context. So that's something that I'd be interested in diving into. And then I think something, if you haven't thought about it a lot, or if it's not something that you engage with often, these last two verses, 17 and 18, really push us to consider what's important about what happens to Jesus and these minute things, seemingly minute things, right? Like Jesus laying his own life down on his own accord, as the NRSV translates it, and having the power to take the life up again. Why is that important? Why would it matter that Jesus has agency in what's happening here? It obviously matters to the gospel writer in the book of John. So I think those are interesting questions to dive into this week. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Reading the Bible is Easy-ish. I am so appreciative, and I'm looking forward to introducing this new format where we have a co-host each week with a smattering of guests across that as well. I hope you'll enjoy that. You can find this, if you're finding this on YouTube, I'd invite you to find it on Apple Podcast as well. There is a special ending to the show that goes on the podcast that does not get included on YouTube for copyright reasons. So I invite you to like, subscribe, and share. And if you have any comments, leave those below. And of course, if you have any guests that you'd like to recommend, or if you'd like to be on the show yourself, I asked my mom and she said, heck no. You can send those to readingthebibleiseasyish@gmail.com. And you can, just send anything you'd like there. So thank you again for joining us for this episode of Reading the Bible is Easy-ish. We'll be back next week, and I look forward to seeing you then. Until then, keep reading the Bible.